Yiddie-di-di, yay-di, yay-di-di. Yiddie-di-di, yay-di-di. Yiddie-di-di, yay-di-di. Yiddie-di-di, yay-di-di. Yiddie-di-di, yay-di, yay-di-di.
A new day, a new week, a new month. In the rhythm of the Jewish sacred time, this moment marks several new beginnings. As Shabbat ends, we begin a new day and a new week. And tonight, we begin the new Jewish month of Nisan. Nisan is the month in which we observe Passover, a time we are taught to look back and to look forward, to look deep inside ourselves and to look out into the world and to hold all these perspectives at once. We recall the ancient Israelites as if we too had left Mitzrayim, the narrow place, the land of Egypt. We imagine the struggles of confinement, vulnerability, the loss of humanity. We imagine the possibility of liberation, of community, of sanctity. And when the story of our long-awaited liberation is complete, we sing praises of gratitude to God for having delivered us from bondage into freedom, a new beginning. Today we are also looking back and looking forward. We are marking the 1-year anniversary of COVID in the United States. We too have been scarred by our struggles and worn down in isolation. Our relational lives have become diminished. We yearn to trade our anxieties for human touch. The weight of the grief and the loss bears down on our souls, the weight of carrying those losses, counting those losses, holding those losses. At this 1-year mark, we are still unable to cast off those burdens. Yet the rhythm of Jewish sacred time, following the phases of the moon, reminds us that there is darkness and suffering, and there are also brighter days ahead. May this new day, this new week, this new month bring us a renewal of wonder, a renewal of freedom, a renewal of love, a renewal of justice, a renewal of friendship, and a renewal of holiness. Amen.
Many of us over the last few years have had such an interest in our family history. And during the pandemic, I thought about my own experience. My grandfather, Henry Levine, in 1918, in his early 20s, began assisting my great-grandfather Jacob in a storefront funeral home on Salem Street, known as the Jewish Street, in the North End of Boston. The North End was an enclave of tenements with Irish and Jewish families living so close together. They came here to find a new country, to find opportunities. Right after the First World War, soldiers coming back to America came back with the flu. It turned out it was the Spanish flu pandemic, which lasted 2 years around the world. I was in my first semester of college when we were studying pandemics and plagues in one course. And during the first semester, I kept thinking about, well, how did my grandfather and great-grandfather serve their families during this horrific time in our history? So, I came home, I went to his house, I walked in, I asked him. I just sat down and asked him, Pop, tell me about the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. I'm studying in college. Can you tell me something about it? How did you help families during that time? He looked at me and he said, I just don't want to talk about it. So, I dropped it. But interestingly enough, in 1972, just a couple of months before he passed away, we were talking about his life. And I brought it up again, and this time, he talked about it. He told me it was chaos. He had very little sleep, there were multiple deaths in families, and he had lost a lot of his friends from his class at English high school. He said the city of Boston suggested that we use mass graves. They didn't know anything about our traditions. My grandfather and great-grandfather said absolutely not. And there were also very few Jewish cemeteries at the time. It turned out that my grandfather and my great-grandfather would be the only ones at the cemetery. And these services were held weeks after people passed away. And then he said that you could hear during the day in the tenements the crying and screaming. And then he stopped and he said, "You know what? You've heard enough. Thank God you will never see anything like that in your lifetime again." And here we are, 100 years later. Unimaginable. Whether you have COVID or not and you pass away from it, it doesn't matter. The protocols are the same. The services are held private at graveside, with very few people in attendance. At one cemetery, the service doesn't start until the crew has already buried the person. And instead of family and mourners doing the most essential graveside of putting earth into the grave, it's done by a front-end loader, depriving these families of that wonderful tradition, the mitzvah of covering the grave themselves. It's something that none of us couldn't get used to. I've had children who've had to bury parents and not even be there. They live so far away. And widows and widowers with no one to comfort them, no hugs from grandchildren or family members. No minions at synagogues. None of the traditions that are so essential to get us all through the mourning process. It has been an opening into my eyes of how dear those traditions are important to all of us. Today, my daughter Marcy has entered the funeral business after teaching in the Newton school system and raising 2 granddaughters. We're so proud to have her, and she represents the 5th generation of our family to be involved in the funeral business. Hopefully, one day, her granddaughter will come to her and say, "How did you take care of families during the COVID pandemic?" She might look at her and say, "We tried to do everything possible under the most extraordinary, difficult circumstances." This will end. It will end. And our families, our synagogues, and our traditions will be stronger than ever. Hopefully, that day will come soon.
I pulled up a chair to her bedside. Lying in front of me is a 60-year-old widow with a new diagnosis, and she is asked to meet with a chaplain. Before any words were spoken, she extended her hands. "Please, I haven't felt the touch of a human for 6 months." In that moment, my gut clenched in fear. Would it be safe to touch her? And I equally sensed a profound yearning from her heart. We held hands for the duration of our 20-minute visit. I reached out by phone to the spouse of a patient in the ICU. After I assured him that I was not calling with medical updates, I heard a deep sigh and then a flood of tears. I waited in silence. He asked me if I had a few minutes, and then said he'd like to share their story. For 45 minutes, I listened and learned about their love at first sight across the dance floor, the ups and downs of business ventures, treasured travel adventures, and what it meant to them to live their Jewish lives. he wanted to make sure that I received a true picture of the woman with whom he shared his life, the full humanity, competency, and uniqueness of the woman he was now unable to visit, and for whom I'd only been able to offer prayers through the thick glass door. I was finishing my visit with a patient who had been in the hospital for well over a month. "I just wanted to tell you," she said, "even though you are masked and with that plastic shield, your smiling eyes have made me feel better." As a chaplain, I'm a witness and a sacred vessel. In creating what I believe to be covenantal relationships, I accompany, I offer my presence, and I hold stories of patients, families, and staff. In that regard, I could say that the past year has been like many others, but no. For these 12 months, I and all of my colleagues have found ourselves feeling much like our patients, despairing, fearful, uncertain, isolated, and perhaps even ill. We too have been daily immersed in a world of grief. And yet, I have also been surrounded and sustained by moments in which resilience, strength, possibility, and hope have found an opening. It is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and a sliver of the new moon's light is now visible tonight. May we all be blessed with moments of light, hope, and possibility as we enter through the next doorway from what has been an extraordinarily challenging journey into the message of Passover.
The light and the feel of the March air, all that is now and also was 1 year ago, calls us to remember. Calls us to remember where we were, who we were, the lives we lived 1 year ago, and also calls us into the present and asks us, who are we now? What have we lost? What have we learned? How have we grown? How have we been shaped through and around this extraordinary time of loss and change, fear and sorrow and hope? I'd like to offer you my reflections in the form of a poem. Grief constrained and expansive in an unmarked and foreign landscape. We could not gather as our beloved ones were gathered to our people. When we gathered last to remember our exodus, our eyes stung from the desert dust of our new wilderness. Our hearts built walls around themselves to guide us safely from one step to the next. History becomes memory, becomes reality, becomes history, becomes memory again. Again and again we tell our story. We shape it in our telling. And in this time, at this season, we must tell it before we have lived it all. We must remember the souls of 525,000, even as breath leaves thousands more every day. Needlessly and painfully, without their beloved ones to hold them. Sometimes the thought of this catches us, entangles us, forces us to stop this version of normalcy. Our breath catches and we catch each other, and we keep stepping into the wilderness ahead and around us with bits of breath opening us as we open to it. New life, new hope, falling like manna, nourishing us so that we can erect memorials to remember, altars to give thanks, open lungs, open hearts to receive wisdom and light out of terror and trauma, lighting our way forward while remembering to look back, giving voice to our fear, our anger, our grief, our disbelief, naming and claiming each loss of something precious, holding each loss tenderly so that it can hold us but not constrain us, so that we can create a future when we'll tell this story in its whole and holy fullness, while we live into a new one. History becomes memory, becomes reality, becomes history, becomes memory again. May our memory be a blessing.
Thank you, Rabbi Suzanne Offit, David Bresniak, Chaplain Nancy Smith, and Rabbi Audrey Marcus Berkman for speaking to us with such honesty about this challenging year. And thank you, Rabbi Micah Shapiro and Aaron Albert, for that beautiful music. We've all had different pandemic experiences, and they are all hard. Some of us have experienced sickness or loss. All of us have experienced craving a state of normal, wanting to reach out for human connection and human touch, even while we live in fear of what that connection might do to us. Now we've made it through a year, a whole year. And part of what has helped us is that while we've all been suffering, we've also all been able to support each other, as we're doing now, as we've done in our communities, and as I've seen in our JF&CS support groups and through the kindness of volunteers helping others. We're drawing strength by acknowledging our shared vulnerability, and we're figuring out ways to connect despite the constraints. And as we look outside now, we can see reasons for hope. The days are getting longer and warmer. The birds are singing. And here we are together, acknowledging our vulnerability, but also lifting each other up. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for stepping from alone to together.